Hey, it's Kirsten. This is part 2 of my conversation with Luke Stark, an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University in London, Ontario, and Jevan Hutson, an associate at Hintze Law PLLC. We're talking about their paper, Physiognomic Artificial Intelligence, which appeared in the Fordham Intellectual Property, Media, and Entertainment Law Journal. In part 1, we started with the troubling history of physiognomy and phrenology. These two pseudosciences were widely discredited in the 20th century, but their notions that people's external appearances can be a way to access internal truths about them have made a comeback in the form of AI systems that purport to be able to perform this type of analysis. Here, we pick things up with me asking Jevan about the menu of regulatory options he and Luke propose in the paper to remedy the fundamental problems with this physiognomic AI. So, Jevan, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the remedies, the law. I thought it was interesting, like the mechanisms that we might approach this. It's not a small detail, but I was surprised to see, and it's an anecdote kind of in the beginning, that there were competing bills in Washington state legislature around facial recognition technology, which excluded facial analysis and emotional extrapolation from the definition. That amazed me because it's one of the major problems. It just took a whole bunch of the problems of facial recognition and said, we're just excluding this from the bill. But anyway, there are other remedies, but that was an interesting example.
Yeah, well, I mean, in many ways, this paper kind of came out of those sort of initial legislative discourses around facial recognition in Washington state, where we had sort of one side of sort of community advocates and impacted communities advocating for sort of the abolition or banning or prohibition of facial recognition technologies, where on the sort of the other side of the aisle, we had many of the larger, companies here in Washington state attempting to, scope regulation to simply facial recognition, because to expand it to any other form of facial analysis would impact a host of other artificial intelligence and machine learning tools that they are either currently working on, developing, or currently use. So their sort of goal was to sort of keep the conversation to facial recognition, because to open it up to facial analysis, so to speak, would both hurt the bottom line and otherwise sort of impede other efforts, which in many ways here inspired the paper. It's like, well, all of those other things are like fundamentally worse. Like facial recognition is bad, is contemptible, is worthy of prohibition, as communities and advocates have laid out over years, right? But this entire other arena is deserving of an incredibly higher level of scrutiny from lawmakers and regulators. And so for us, in terms of sort of developing how do we address physiognomic AI, obviously we situate our response in sort of the field of abolition, where obviously the goal is to abolish physiognomic AI systems. We fundamentally reject computer vision applied to humans. And so we have to think about, okay, what sort of mechanisms, at least in the United States, might allow us to sort of effectuate the abolition of physiognomic artificial intelligence. And sort of first and foremost, we sort of start with consumer protection law, which in the United States has really been sort of the active area for thinking about sort of unfairness in AI and how, we might prevent these systems or otherwise regulate them. Obviously, sort of reflecting on some of the limitations of consumer protection law, we sort of aim for legislators actively sort of enshrining physiognomic AI as being unfair and deceptive per se, effectively where consumer protection regulators don't have to go through arguing why physiognomic AI is like unfair or deceptive under extant standards. And as I think we've laid out, it's like these are fundamentally morally bankrupt systems that, federal regulators should have the ability to sort of sidestep like a massive investigative process, because higher review can throw research papers from various institutions and sort of engage in this sort of unnecessary process. And so we sort of talk about different ways in which they might be sort of legislated as being unfair and deceptive. We talk about sort of some of our efforts that we undertook in Washington state to attempt to do that. In Washington state, for example, there's like 160 different practices under state consumer protection law that are sort of fundamentally unfair and deceptive.
And so just to understand that really fast, the argument is, which I like, is that this is snake oil, to use Arvind's term. This is snake oil. And as a class of computer vision offerings, of AI offerings, it should just be labeled as unfair and deceptive. To claim that you can identify someone as trustworthy, happy, sad, whatever it might be, anything, possible shoplifter, whatever whatever the purported computer vision AI is saying, it's not possible. It's pseudoscience. And so it would be considered deceptive. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me given your paper. So I can understand why you make the argument.
Yeah. No, all I'd add to that is sort of the levers there, whether that's the FTC making a policy statement, engaging in Magnuson-Moss rulemaking, or rather just lawmakers just fundamentally enshrining it to, give further direction to, consumer protection authorities.
Just really quickly, I mean, one reason why it's snake oil, right, is the kind of broken telephone that happens between academic papers or actual machine learning results, right, which often are pretty narrow, and they present a kind of statistical, a probability range that then somehow becomes this kind of like 100% we can do X, Y, and Z, right? So whenever you're looking at one of these claims by a company, you got to really break down exactly on what experimental basis are they making the claim in the first place. And then, of course, on top of these kind of conceptual problems that backstop the argument. So, but that's it's hard to do that. You have to have a lot of data. You have to have the data from the companies themselves, and so that's why right. I think we can say to the FTC, look, this is just not accurate. This is unfair.
Right.
And it builds on some of the stuff that the FTC has already put out with respect to guidance around AI, where they're like, don't overstate the findings, don't overstate the sort of capacity of your AI, do not state that your AI is bias free.
Right.
And here we sort of think like this is an arena of sort of AI and ML technologies that just need to be fundamentally off limits. Like they are fundamentally unfair, they are fundamentally deceptive on so many different levels and it sort of represents an area that we think the FTC and state consumer protection regulators can sort of say, this is the red line. Like facial analysis onward that is attempting to predict these particular characteristics is a no-go, and we're going to effectively police it under, federal or state consumer protection law. And we think that might be a very helpful incentive to maybe stop, larger institutions and smaller institutions from, proceeding to, developing and deploying these systems.
I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But on top of that, we unpack sort of other mechanisms as well. Our goal is really to offer sort of a menu and a toolkit of options for policymakers, because no body of law is necessarily perfect. And so we also talk about potentially enshrining in this in the context of biometric law. We could imagine in sort of the context of BIPA adding a sort of another categorical prohibition. We also talk about anti-discrimination law and building on some work we also had done here in Washington State around attempting to prohibit these systems in places of public accommodation. As sort of a broad brush prohibition, this would obviously touch on a host of both quasi-private and public institutions, that shape access to basic social goods, but also just, impact people's dignity, right? The ability to go into a store or to go about public life and not be impacted by systems that are trying to categorize you as being suspicious or a criminal, or even just categorizing you along particular protected class lines, that impacts our ability to enjoy public life. And it really calls into, some of the similar questions under civil rights law. And so our goal is to offer a menu of options. I think Physiognomic AI raises enough concern that we need to exhaust legal methods that we at least have here in the US. I think we have existing tools that could allow us to abolish Physiognomic AI, but obviously they're worthy of new potential frameworks and paradigms. But I think we have a toolkit. It requires a political will that I think is, again, part of we hope to be the conversation and discourse around like how we prevent both facial recognition and larger facial analysis systems that bring in physiognomic art.
Yeah, I liked how you gave a menu of options, with the first bucket being unfair and deceptive, which given your paper makes a lot of sense. And I thought the idea of biometric was a good, I mean, they're all good avenues. It gives people a couple of options.
I mean, isn't it funny that we have in some ways it almost feels like we're overdoing it, because we have all of these options and we point to all the ways that these technologies run afoul of all these different kinds of regulation. But right, I mean, it's odd that would be, this is so obviously a problem across so many different vectors and facets that it makes it sort of all the more amazing that these technologies are not just continuing to exist, but are still being feted largely. Now, of course, there's been a lot of pushback in the last couple of years, but not enough. I really analogize these technologies to a rotten onion. where the counter arguments for these technologies proponents tend to kind of involve these different layers. So you talk about the problems of use. We know there are lots of issues with the use of these technologies around discrimination, the chilling of political speech, etc. Well, the response from technologists in favor of technologies is, oh well, we'll just improve them. Well, that's not the response. The response to the use case is, well, we have nothing to do with that. We have no ability to change how people use these technologies, which is obviously not true. Then there's the technical problem.
I mean, they patent it. You know what I mean?
Like, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah. So, and then there are the technical issues, and the response to the technical issues around accuracy is, oh well, we'll just get more data. It'll be better. And so that's and so that's the second layer of the rotten onion. But then I think that's why it was so important to make this point in the paper at a conceptual level. Quantifying the human face and body and putting those quantifications into kind of categories and classifications and conversation with each other it just automatically opens up the door to things that we would recognize as racism and sexism and other forms of discrimination. And so at a conceptual level, like even the center of that onion is rotten. And that's why we're so committed to all of these different legal remedies, because the whole edifice is just not good.
Right. And I think that's where you can feel this huge disconnect, and where I think actually the paper does a nice job of saying that within people that study AI ethics, or just in general, it is just a non-starter. You know what I mean? Like it's you see it and it's offensive on so many levels, and you do a great job of explaining how offensive it is, both as like a dignity harm, as actual harm to people, as actually just doesn't even work, but we're still kind of going through the motions and harming people for no benefit of it whatsoever. And yet the other side is almost extremely the opposite, where the opposite meaning it's commercialization and use within governments and businesses, and even research as an endeavor continues to proliferate. And they're kind of shocked when there's pushback. And it just, out of all the areas that we all look at, it seems to be this one area where the two sides seem so far apart, versus like the use of consumer data just generally, even those within organizations have to say, well, I mean, there are no laws. I mean, they kind of know that it's not great, right? Like they kind of admit it, but this one, they don't seem to admit that it's wrong at all. I mean, there's Wall Street Journal articles about it. The Washington Post writes about it. It just seems to proliferate with how you could get through. How can we categorize students? How can we look at people who are applying for a job? How can we look at people en masse when they're in the airport? How can we identify future terrorists? Like all of this, who's actually going to be trustworthy to give them a loan? All these uses that you would think, and the matchmaking that you point out are based on this pseudoscience that, as you rightly put, the scientifically baseless, racist, and discredited pseudoscientific fields which purport to determine people's characters, capabilities, and future prospects based on their facial features or the shapes of their skulls should be anathema to any researcher or product developer working in computer science today. And so we see it and think, anathema. You know what I mean? This is like, and yet, you do a great job of listing all the ways it keeps going.
I think one thing just really quickly to say, and this speaks to this idea that the physiognomic impulse, went sort of underground, but didn't disappear between, let's say, 1945 and 2005 or whatever it was, right? Is that I think a lot of scientific disciplines, evolutionary biology, certain parts of anthropology, right? A lot of scientific disciplines have kept vestiges of this kind of physiognomic idea. Or have not interrogated closely what they're actually studying and what the proxies that they think they're looking at, and that what they think tell them things actually tell them. And I think that's, so I think actually a lot of people in the sciences, they wouldn't agree with phrenology, they wouldn't agree with some of these kind of crass physiognomic ideas, but there would be a kind of belief that you can tell certain things, maybe quite limited things, about individuals based on exterior traits. And again, informally, right? Some humans do that all the time, and we are more or less good at it, often less good at it. So I think that's part of why this keeps going. And I think
agree.
we in the sciences, or broadly in the sciences and social sciences, really need to have that conversation and really dig into the assumptions in some of those fields. Because there's been lots of great critical work, from in STS more broadly, that makes the point that none of these fields have been studying the things that they think they're studying, right? They're not the proxy data that they're using is not necessarily determinative. Some of the underlying assumptions that are being made are indeed racist and sexist, and so this is a bigger conversation for the quote unquote human sciences to be having. Some folks in those fields are, absolutely, but not everybody is. And so when those more retrograde notions from those fields get applied in computer vision, that's where you get these big problems.
That's great. Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate the work and the thoroughness by which you both go through the problem and the scope of the issue in general. And so as I usually wrap up, I'd like to ask people if there's anyone in the field of tech ethics, it can be in your discipline or someone totally outside your discipline, that you look forward to hearing from. It can be a young scholar, someone that is like you look forward to seeing what their work is, or there's new work that you like to talk about.
There are just so many awesome folks. I mean, I'll give a couple of shout outs to Canadians, fellow Canadians that I really love. One is Deb Raji, who I think his work is probably well known by now, but who is doing awesome things at the Mozilla Foundation on these topics. The second is Catherine Stinson. She's in philosophy and computer science at Queen's University, and she has a neuroscience background and is really working hard to produce like empirical studies that kind of systematically work through the methodology of some of these physiognomic AI papers and debunk it. So that's really, really awesome work too. So they're fabulous. There's so many awesome, amazing voices in this space. It's wonderful. It's wonderful that there's so much good work happening right now.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I mean, to Luke's point, to Deb's paper at FACT, the fallacy of AI functionality, I think really hits home to some of this, that regulators really need to consider, like, how do we respond to AI when we let go of the assumption that it fundamentally works. Outside of the academic space, I want to give a shout out to Jennifer Lee at the ACLU of Washington, who's been doing, I think, some really great work on the policy front and trying to expand not only say like the express definition of facial recognition, but thinking about how we can drive sort of community-centric tech policy and sort of expanding, the traditional discourses around what's possible and leveraging sort of existing, regulatory frameworks to say prohibit physiognomic AI as well as facial recognition and other problematic tools.
Well, gosh, I really appreciate it. And thanks so much. It's great to talk with you. And I really love the paper. And I knew Luke was working on work that was around this area. So I was excited when it came out, and I'm really glad that you guys did it. And thanks for coming on and spending, 40 minutes with me and stuff. But anyway, thank you very much for coming.
It's such a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Of course. Great to finally meet you.
Tech Talks is a production of the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center. For more, visit techethics.nd.edu.